Scientists estimate that there are almost 500,000 different types of plants in the world. Let's learn more about the classification and naming of plants. This presentation is brought to you by King Garden Education and Iron Bee Learning. What do you think of when you hear the word corn? If you're an American, you probably picture corn on the cob, but if you were from England, you might think of wheat instead. Common names can be very confusing. To avoid the confusion of common names, we should give each organism a unique scientific name, a name that can be used around the world. We also need an organized classification system for grouping organisms that shows relationships between the organisms. Scientists have developed a field called systematics, which is the study of the diversity of organisms and their evolutionary relationships. Systematics has two goals. One, we need to give each organism a unique scientific name. Taxonomy is the science of naming and classifying organisms. The second goal is to create an organized system for grouping organisms that shows relationships. That led to the development of phylogeny, which is the evolutionary history of an organism or its family tree. The person who developed a system that is still used to some extent today was Carl von Linné, also known as Linnaeus. He developed a taxonomy using a hierarchical system of classification. You may have learned this system: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Think of the kingdom as being a big box that holds a large number of organisms. Within the kingdom, there are smaller boxes that hold phyla. Within each phylum are even smaller boxes called classes, and so on. DNA research has resulted in a modification of the Linnaean system to include larger groups, domains, and supergroups. So the largest group of all is the domain, and it includes supergroups. Within supergroups, we have kingdoms. Kingdoms have many phyla, or phylums. Within the phylum, there are classes, and then orders. Families are a smaller category. Within families, there is the genus or genera, and then finally, the species is the most specific. The three domains that are recognized by most biologists today are bacteria and archaea. These are called prokaryotes. They have tiny, simple cells with no nucleus. Domain eukarya, or the eukaryotes, are more complex, larger cells that do have a nucleus. Plants, animals, fungi, and many one-celled organisms belong to domain eukarya. Now we can see the complete classification of corn, which is in domain eukarya, supergroup Archaeplastida, kingdom Chloroplastida. In addition to developing a hierarchical system of classification, Linnaeus also developed binomial nomenclature to give each organism a unique scientific name used around the world. Every type of organism or species has a scientific name which includes both its generic and specific name. For example, humans' generic name is Homo, the specific name is sapiens. So our scientific name is Homo sapiens. We have to follow certain rules when we write a scientific name. The generic name is capitalized and the specific name is lowercase. The scientific name is usually in Latin or a foreign language, so it must be written in italics or underlined. The scientific name of corn is Zea mays, in italics, or ZMAs underlined is also correct. To add to the confusion, many species have a number of different varieties that may have different common names. For example, did you know that kale, cabbage, broccoli, and Brussels sprouts are all members of the same species? They are different varieties of Brassica oleracea. A variety is a subgroup of plants that differs from other members of the species in some way. The word cultivar comes from two words, cultivated variety. Cultivars have been produced by selective breeding to have particularly desirable characteristics. A cultivar is essentially a patent on a plant, which yields royalties to the plant developer. Let's take a look at the evolution of plants. All land plants evolved about 500 million years ago from a single freshwater green algae species. Currently, we have four major groups of plants, including the non-vascular plants, seedless vascular plants, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. The green algae ancestors of plants lived in the water, but living on land poses many challenges. Even though there's more oxygen and carbon dioxide, dehydration is a problem on dry land. Gravity pulls down the plant. There may be temperature extremes, UV radiation, and of course, reproduction in a dry environment becomes a problem because sperm can no longer swim to eggs. Another thing is that algae release their embryos into water, which would quickly dehydrate on land. But land plants are all embryophytes. That means that the parent retains the embryos on the plant body to prevent dehydration. Non-vascular plants are also called bryophytes. They are restricted to moist areas because they don't have vascular tissue for transport. They don't have true roots, stems, or leaves. As a result, non-vascular plants tend to be quite small. They can only reproduce in moist areas because they have flagellated sperm that have to swim to eggs. Non-vascular plants include mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. A giant in the non-vascular world might be 6 inches or so tall, but they can't grow any taller because they lack vascular tissue and, as we mentioned, don't have roots, stems, or leaves. All vascular plants have vessels, called xylem and phloem, that transport water, minerals, and food throughout the plant. Because they have a good transport system, they can grow larger. Vascular tissue also helps support plants against the force of gravity. Vascular plants include the seedless vascular plants, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. Seedless vascular plants do have vascular tissue, so they're able to grow larger than the mosses and liverworts. But they're somewhat restricted to moist areas because the sperm still have to swim to the eggs and require water to reproduce. They produce spores instead of seeds. Spores are tiny and have no stored food for an embryo. So a seedless vascular plant has to produce millions and millions of spores. Seedless vascular plants include ferns, horsetails, club mosses, and whisk ferns. One big challenge of life on a dry environment is reproduction, and seed plants have solved most of the problems. They no longer have sperm who have to swim. Instead, pollen carries sperm through dry air, so seed plants can reproduce in dry conditions. They no longer make spores. Instead, they have seeds that surround, protect, and nourish developing embryos, making it possible for seed plants to live in fairly harsh conditions on dry land. The seed plants include gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms are seed plants that don't have flowers. In fact, the term gymnosperm literally means naked seed because seeds are not in fruits but are produced by cones or on scales. Gymnosperms include ginkgos. They're sometimes called a living fossil because they've lived relatively unchanged for the past 80 million years. They have fairly broad leaves and seeds which resemble plums and smell horrible. You never want to plant a female ginkgo. Cycads are also gymnosperms. They resemble palms and have fleshy exposed seeds in very large cones in the center of the plant. Another group are the cnidophytes. This is a small phylum of about 70 species. The most familiar gymnosperms are the conifers. Pine, spruce, junipers, redwood trees, and so on belong in this group. They have needles, very well developed vascular tissue, roots, and pollen. The angiosperms are the flowering plants. They produce seeds inside flowers and form fruits. About 80% of all land plants are angiosperms. They're distributed throughout the world, and they're very important to us because they provide food, oxygen, shelter, fiber, drugs, and so on for both people and animals on land. These are the plants that are probably most familiar to us, including grasses, deciduous trees, dandelions, roses, tulips, tomatoes, lilac bushes, and so on. There are two major types of angiosperms. It's based on the number of seed leaves, or cotyledons. A monocotyledon only has one seed leaf. These plants have parallel venation, where the veins are basically in parallel lines on the leaf. They tend to have a fibrous root system and flower parts in multiples of 3. Within the monocotyledons, we find grasses, corn, lilies, tulips, and so on. Dicotyledons have 2 seed leaves. They tend to have more of a net-like venation, a taproot system, and flower parts in multiples of 4s or 5s. Apple trees, roses, marigolds are all dicotyledons.